This is the school where I got my first 3 college degrees. You can't see me popping my collar, but I assure you I am. Nah, I almost never wear collars these days. So what did I pop? You saw the title, but I'll give a proper introduction anyway. This is a story about my experience as a fine arts major at Sacramento City College, a community college that sits between Land Park and Curtis Park in Sacramento, California. And since this story will focus specifically on my fine arts major, most of what I will tell you took place between 2008 and 2010. But first, a little background. I actually graduated high school in 2005, originally intending to go to Solano Community College. But my family lived in Sacramento and Sac City had a track team, so I figured, why not voluntarily continue the sport where you run until you feel worse than death? For fun. In addition to focusing on athletics, I initially majored in math before switching to psychology, before dropping out twice, and working a number of awful customer service jobs that drove me back to college because it doesn't take long to realize you don't want to get bossed around for the rest of your life at the rate of $8 per hour. So when I re-enrolled for the spring 2008 semester, I did so with 2 goals. 1, graduate as quickly as possible, and 2, get into the best school I possibly can. After exhausting Sac City's list of majors and requirements, I found the one major that gave me the best shot at graduating both quickly and with honors. Compared to other majors offered, the fine arts major consisted of a short list of requirements. Take at least one major from at least 5 of the following 6 departments: art, art history, humanities, music, photography, and theater. I figured I've always been decent at drawing and writing essays, and I have no history with music, so naturally music is the department I avoided. If you're currently scrolling through the Programs and Majors page on Sac City's website, you'll notice there is no fine arts major, presumably because it no longer exists. This comes as no surprise because even back when I was a fine arts major, I wondered why it existed, considering its overlap and redundancies with other arts and humanities majors. But admittedly, the major is ideal for generalists like myself who have creative identity crises. Now it was time to get to work. This was my spring 2008 schedule. I'm not sure why track and field was on the schedule since I didn't compete that year, but that is what my old transcript says. Anyway, in preparation for Art 300, the drawing course, I drew this charcoal portrait of Abraham Lincoln from an image I googled and brought it to one of the first classes. The portrait helped give me a reputation as a good artist, probably undeservedly. Pro tip for those of you whose goal is to become an honor student: your reputation is valuable because having a good one will give you the benefit of the doubt if you ever submit an assignment that is subpar by your standards. This elementary drawing and composition course is self-explanatory. It's an introduction to drawing and composition and serves as the starting point for anyone majoring in a visual arts or design degree. I recall this course requiring graphite, charcoal, and acrylic paint. Humanities 300 was the course I was least mentally prepared for heading into the semester because admittedly I didn't know what humanities even was. This modern humanities course covered cultural movements from the Renaissance to the present. I don't recall this course having a final exam, but I did have a midterm I slightly struggled with, which didn't matter since the vast majority of the grade consisted of the 3 take-home essays assigned throughout the semester, all of which I performed very well on. If you ever wanted to feel like Ansel Adams, Photo 301 is for you. In this beginning photography course, I got a hands-on experience of old-school black and white film development. In this course, you buy an old film camera along with the appropriate roll of film to take photos that fulfill various assignment categories. For example, for this assignment, you will go out and shoot a portrait. You would then take those negatives and develop them using a process that puts water and electricity very close together in a dark room. Because what could possibly go wrong? This underdeveloped portrait of my then toddler sister and brother is the only surviving image from that semester. No, seriously, I have no idea where any of the prints are, and this is the only digital copy of an image I could find after going through every storage device I have. In addition to the lab section, this course also had a classroom section, seen here in these images that were ironically taken with the 1 megapixel digital camera I carried around, which is what I used for the majority of the old digital images you see in this video from my time as a student. And lastly, there was TA 300, Intro to Theater. I don't remember any of the material from this class. I do have 4 memories from this class. It was my first class of the day, probably 8 a.m. Over the span of 2 classes, we watched the film Tootsie. The teacher once angrily lectured the class about arriving on time because most of the students not named Raymond were regularly late, and for whatever reason, we were required to usher 2 of the school's theater performances that semester. Oh, who am I kidding? It's just easier to force students to do it than it is to pay actual ushers. Academically, I had a quiet summer. I spent the beginning of it in Arkansas with extended family before returning to conclude the summer by fulfilling a University of California transfer requirement with this English writing course. On to the semester that taught me that taking 17 units is probably not the best idea if you want a legit shot at a straight A semester. I'll quickly get my fall 2008 bitterness out of the way by revealing the one class I failed to ace. I got 89.4% in poli-sci. And before you ask, yes, I talked to the professor and he said there's nothing I could do about it, so let's just move on to the rest of the schedule. As you can see, I took a breather from the all-creative mode to knock out some more University of California requirements, which is why I went with a heavy yet diverse schedule. I mean, there are research and writing courses, an art course, a language course, a science course, and even a collegiate sport. But since we're here to talk about the fine arts major, I'll only cover Art 334, the acrylic painting course, which admittedly I remember nothing about. So much for covering it. After combing through my external hard drives, the only paintings I found from that semester are this bottle, this janky image of the Sacramento skyline, and whatever this is supposed to be. Painting is not my creative strength. Also, I don't believe any of these 3 paintings were assignments from that class. But I need B-roll, so here's a couple of Zeitgeist clips from that semester. Now on to spring 2009. As I look back on my transcript, I assume this is the point where I exhausted all of my financial aid eligibility because things start to get a little weird. Up to this point, there were few, if any, academic blemishes, but from this point until I left Sac City, I see many withdrawals on my transcript and even one class I didn't pass that I would later need to make up. That class was Stat 300, Intro to Probability and Statistics. Until this point in the video, I focused on the fine arts major, but I'm going to switch gears and focus on my push to transfer following the spring 2009 semester, which gives me a convenient excuse not to cover whatever I learned in Art History 300, because I don't remember any of it. Let's take a high-level view of the spring 2009 semester. 1, this was my return to the track, and 2, my goal was to transfer to a University of California school in fall 2009. I won't cover the track season here since it's worth its own separate video, which I'll link to this one if I ever get around to making it. Recall me mentioning that I exhausted my financial aid eligibility. This meant I could not afford the textbook for my statistics course, which made performing in the class impossible. Why not get a job, Raymond? Yeah, that whole running thing again. This statistics class is the type of class students usually withdraw from when they know they won't pass, but unfortunately remaining eligible for collegiate athletics requires maintaining a full-time schedule, which meant I needed to just do whatever it took to keep my instructor from dropping me so I wouldn't be forced to quit track mid-season. Fortunately, I performed well in the other classes because surprisingly they didn't require textbooks. You better believe I aced that human sexuality class. Though I never did receive an answer to the question I wrote down when the instructors asked each student to write down what we wanted to get out of the class, because apparently asking them how to talk to girls is like asking your chemistry professor how to split an atom. Anyway, I had fulfilled all fine arts major requirements and all University of California transfer requirements except for the UC math requirement, which I could fulfill by simply getting a job at the end of track season so I could afford the statistics textbook that would enable me to retake Stat 300 in the summer before transferring. Or so I thought. At the end of track season, I did successfully land a job and rode the wave of momentum from that along with letters of interest pouring in from universities into application season. The Ivy League letters arrived too late for me to put together applications, so they were out of the question. So it was down to the UC schools. Berkeley had a hard units transfer minimum of 60 that I did not reach, so it was out of the question. Los Angeles had an extensive list of major-specific requirements for incoming art majors that I was not close to meeting, so it was out of the question. So I awaited decisions from Santa Barbara and Davis. Santa Barbara admitted me as an art major into its honors program. Soon after, Davis admitted me into its design major. Not wanting to transfer close to home, I committed to going to UC Santa Barbara. However, the university rescinded my offer based on the fact that I did not fulfill the UC math requirement, which admissions officers told me I needed to have completed before the summer before transferring. This was devastating. The thought of having to wait an entire year to feel like my life was actually getting somewhere was the last thing I wanted to hear. The only silver lining is that I now had a fine arts AA degree in hand. If you came to the video just for the fine arts major material, that portion ends here, but I assure you there's a good reason this story continues. Trying to make the best of remaining trapped in a city I so desperately wanted out of, I spent the summer getting out more into the city and largely avoiding the college. I took my art to the streets of Second Saturday, an event on the second Saturday of every month in downtown Sacramento in which businesses stay open late and artists flood the streets with their work to gain exposure from the massive crowds of passers-by. That summer, I also took my first dive into runway modeling, auditioning and getting accepted into my first of many fashion shows. By the time fall 2009 rolled around, my family moved to another part of town, which we seemed to do almost every semester since I returned to school the previous spring. Unfortunately, since we moved across town away from my job, and I had no reliable transportation in a city as obnoxiously spread out as Sacramento, this meant I had to choose between the job and attending school for the fall 2009 semester. I had an academic requirement to fulfill, so of course I chose school. Unfortunately, having no job meant I faced the same challenge of having to pass Stat 300 without a textbook. In case you're wondering why I was unable to save anything from the job I had for 4 months, my job paid $8 per hour, I only worked very part-time, and I briefly had this clunk of a vehicle that I sank almost every dollar into to keep running, until it decided one day to stop running. So the $400 or whatever I needed for that stats book wasn't there, but this time there was hope. The instructor I had this time kept a book on reserve in the library his students could check out and use while inside the library. Every afternoon of a day in which I had that class, I raced to the library to check the availability of the textbook. Often another student had gotten to it first, but the book was available just often enough for me to make copies of pages using the spare change in my pocket so I could complete bits and pieces of assigned homework, which resulted in me barely passing the course. My incomplete homework combined with lackluster test performances from my limited exposure to the material put me in the rare position of not having the reputation of a great student. This is illustrated by a casual conversation I had with my Stat 300 instructor after a class as we walked toward the parking lot. I recalled him previously mentioning he was a UC Berkeley grad, so naturally I took the conversation in that direction, eventually stating my interest in transferring there. I remember his face transforming from friendly to serious, and in his most dismissive tone, he says, "You have to be really sharp to go there." After telling him I could possibly mention my financial situation in the application letter, he responded with, "Then it will sound like you're just making excuses." He then stormed off in a rage walk that a professor only does when he wants to communicate that his time is being wasted. I would remember this moment. As for the rest of my fall 2009 schedule, you'll notice the additions of 3 art courses. This was my attempt to complete the school's art studio degree to add to my fine arts degree. Yes, those are 2 different degrees, though understandably only the studio one still exists. Unfortunately, my financial situation didn't just affect my Stat 300 performance. Unable to afford the materials needed for Art 320, the Design Fundamentals course, I attempted to complete the assignments using alternate materials when needed. However, on one homework assignment in which students were required to shade 10 different boxes from lightest to darkest using paint, I used graphite because I couldn't afford to buy paint. On the midterm portfolio evaluation, the instructor gave me a crushing C- and added this note: "Raymond, you need to get the required materials. This is required, not optional. Simply not getting them is not okay. You just don't get the same learning experience without paint." This resulted in the future professional designer to drop the course, which meant giving up on the art studio degree, so I went ahead and dropped the drawing course too since it added no value to my academic future or present. Since I previously never took a sculpture course, I saw the value in Art 370, 3D design, both for developing new skills and for becoming a more competitive transfer candidate. Having a pretty cool teacher didn't hurt either. After a brutal autumn, I wanted to relax in my final semester before transferring to a university. I relaxed the only way a Raymond could, by enrolling in a 5-unit math course for fun. I imagine the average number of friends each of you have who would do this is less than 1. See, there's some math right there. Anyway, having fulfilled all my University of California transfer requirements, I truly did consider this pre-calculus course leisure since I had no plans to pass it, considering how difficult it was for me to pass the less challenging statistics course without a textbook. However, over a month into the semester with my grade sitting around D-, my obsession with getting any and all transfer information led to an email exchange with an admissions officer at UC Berkeley who said the current 5-unit course would give me the minimum 60 units that would make me an eligible candidate for Berkeley, though I would need to pass the class with a B or higher. Frantically trying to figure out how to get my hands on some version of the textbook that hopefully either I or a family member could afford, I came across some little website called Amazon.com. This website had a version even I could afford, so I made my first ever Amazon purchase. I wonder how 2010 Raymond would react if someone told him 2020 Raymond makes just about every non-grocery purchase from Amazon. With textbook now in hand, I aced exam after exam in the last 2/3 of the semester to push that D- to a B+ heading into the final. According to a chart my math teacher showed us, I needed just 59 on the final to finish with a final grade of B, which seemed like a piece of cake. So in my head, I was shooting for the 96 that would give me a final grade of A. But it wouldn't be a Raymond story without some last-minute drama, right? On the day of my final, my bus never showed up. It just decided not to come. After waiting what must have been at least a half an hour for a bus that's supposed to run every 15 minutes, I walked a mile down the road to catch a bus on a different line. After sprinting to class, I arrived with only enough time to complete about 40% of the test, which of course wasn't going to cut it considering the grade I needed. So when I got home, I emailed my teacher explaining everything, and mercifully he said I can join his other morning class and take the final there, but that he would give me a much harder version of it. I said great, and showed up bright and early in anticipation for the last moments I would ever need to spend in a community college classroom. This is the score I needed on the final exam, and on that much harder version, this is the score I got. Before I conclude this story, recall me telling you to remember the importance of Stat 300 to my fate. Just imagine an alternate universe where I'm somehow able to afford that statistics textbook, which would have enabled me to pass the class the first time. That almost certainly results in me transferring to Santa Barbara in fall 2009, which means you would have gotten a different sequel to this story.